Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first lecture here in Chapter 20. We're going to take a look at Spain's American Empire. Now, on this map, it's a little misleading because you're only looking at the Spanish Empire's greatest extent in North and Central America. It doesn't include their empire in South America as well, which was pretty extensive. And we'll get into both of these empires or sections of the empire today. All right, so let's get started. All right, so we can't talk about the Spanish Empire in the Americas without first talking about Columbus. And I know we've already talked about him a little bit, but we're going to spend a lot about talking about who he is and his impact here in this chapter. More on that a little bit later. So, in August of 1492, Columbus set sail with three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and they spotted land crossing the Atlantic in October. Now, he believed that he had reached the East Indies, and remember, he's trying to find a route to the Spice Islands in the Pacific. Now, he identified the local natives as Los Indios, believing, again, a connection with the Indies, but he really landed in an island he titled San Salvador, or the Holy Savior, as part of the Bahamas, and claims the land for Spain. Now, he's not only looking for the Spice Islands, but he's also looking for gold, but he doesn't find it. So he ends up going on and claiming other islands. This is the beginning of the Spanish colonies in the Americas. All right. So Columbus, in history, a lot of people forget that he actually did three other voyages to this area as well, not just the initial one in 1492, but over the next decade or so, or a little over a decade or so, he would actually go on a total of 4 voyages around this region. And you can see them here on screen, primarily going throughout the Caribbean and parts of Central America. All right. Now, there's some others as well that we need to talk about in this span of history, especially with the Spanish Empire. Now, we're actually going to talk about a Portuguese sailor here named Pedro Cabral, who claims Brazil for Portugal. And remember, that's a key thing when we talk about, if you think back to the last chapter, we were talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas and those agreements that were made between Spain and Portugal for dividing up these new lands. Now, Amerigo Vespucci is also somebody that's very important here because he is going to identify the lands as a new world and not technically Asia. So the idea that these are new continents, North and South America, and these lands are named America in 1507 after him. Now, back to a Spanish explorer, Balboa. He actually is the first to cross the Isthmus of Panama, reaching the Pacific Ocean. And if you guys don't know where the Isthmus of Panama is, it's right down here. This is what's called an isthmus. And then in 1519 to 1522, we talked about this in the last chapter as well. We have Ferdinand Magellan becoming the first sailor, actually his expedition, to circumnavigate the globe for the first time. And he is killed in the Philippines, like we talked about. And I actually have a little article for you guys from National Geographic that we'll take a look at next week on about him and his adventures and his death in the Philippines. All right, guys, let's move on here. So here's Magellan's voyage here, and this is some very similar map to what we saw in the last chapter. But remember, he starts here in southern Spain, makes his way down the Brazilian coast to the southern tip of South America, going through the Straits of Magellan, which are going to be named after him. Again, remember, this is the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas. And then he's going to make his way and claim the lands over here, the Philippines, for Spain. And this is actually where Magellan is going to die. And then the remainder of his crew are going to make their way back to Spain. All right. Oops. Now, in 1519, Hernan Cortez is going to land in present-day Mexico. Now, throughout his adventures in Mexico, he's going to claim the mainland for Spain. He's searching for gold and silver in particular. He's going to run into the Aztecs, who believe that the Spanish at first are gods. There's going to be some conflicts between them, and ultimately you're going to see the Aztecs and Spanish fight each other. And initially, the Aztecs are going to get the upper hand, even though disease is going to run rampant, and they're going to kick the Spanish out. Now, for all intents and purposes, remember, in terms of settling the Americas, the Spanish are the first European settlers to settle in the Americas. All right. Now let's continue talking about what actually happens in Mexico. We've already talked about this a little bit. If you guys remember back in chapter 16, we talked about the Aztecs and their fall, as well as the Inca, which we'll talk a little bit about here again. We see that Cortez is able to strike back. He's able to take over the Aztecs in 1529, or 1521, excuse me. And even though he's greatly outnumbered, remember, the Spanish have two great advantages over the Aztecs. They have weaponry, such as guns and cannon, and then they have native allies. Because remember, the Aztecs were not necessarily the nicest people to those people they came to control. Now, those are their two greatest advantages just naturally, like in terms of what they have. But their bringing of diseases that the Aztecs and other natives were not used to, is actually going to be their biggest help. And things such as measles, mumps, smallpox, and typhus are going to decimate the Aztec population. They have no built-up immunities. So either they're dying off in great numbers, or they're sick and not capable of defending themselves effectively. And that allows the Spanish to take control fairly quickly, although they're highly outnumbered. All right, now I told you we're going to talk about the Inca just a little bit, and we're going to go back to them. So remember in 1532, we talked about Francisco Pizarro. He is going to conquer the Inca, and he is able to ambush Atahualpa, their leader, at Cajamarca. Okay, now in this exchange, there's a struggle, and in this ambush, and Atahualpa is actually mortally wounded. And there's a ransom put up and all this stuff, and he dies. Okay, and then eventually is strangled to death. Okay, so in 1533, in this campaign, this war between the Inca and the Spanish, you have at last, a little bit after Atahualpa's death, the Incan capital is captured in 1533. And then we also see the Spanish conquer in Central America what is left of the Maya civilization. So basically, by the mid 1500s, we have, for the Spanish, a complete American empire that's created from Central America, Caribbean islands, a majority of them, and South America are all under Spanish control, or at least the western coast of South America. All right, so now we need to talk about really what they did in terms of their empire and settling and so forth. So they used several techniques to help them settle this area, used from the Reconquista, which they had just completed in 1492 in Spain. And if you guys don't remember what the Reconquista is, it was the driving out of the Muslim state and people from the Iberian Peninsula by Spain. Now, they start to live amongst the natives, but they're very oppressive. They did this in southern Spain when you have native Muslims and Spanish coming in. Now, in this case, they're doing it with Spanish coming in and living with Native Americans amongst them. They start to impose their culture directly on the natives in any number of ways. This is not just religious means, but it's also other cultural traditions as well. And then you also have a group that becomes known as the Peninsulares, which are male settlers that go over, and they, over time, very quickly, mix with the native women and have children, and their offspring are going to be known as mestizos. So those offspring are a mixture of European and native descent. Now, the goal of the Spanish Empire, as we're going to see also throughout history for really any empirical power, primarily Europeans, is that they want to exploit the land's resources. And what system do they develop for this? It's called the encomienda system in the Spanish Empire. Basically what it is, it's kind of like a plantation type system of work where the natives are forced to gather goods and resources for their Spanish rulers. The conditions are very poor, and many are worked to death, or to the point they can't work, and then they're no longer useful. And then you have to also add in, remember, they don't have the immunity to European diseases. So there's hugely appalling conditions here with the encomienda system for the natives. Now, we're going to switch and actually talk a little bit about Brazil here in this section as well, and some of the Portuguese lands in the Americas, since we're talking about the American Empire, and we really haven't talked about the introduction of the British and French yet. So we're going to talk about Brazil here. Now, Brazil is brought under control of the Portuguese under Cabral. And then also you have to remember the delineation of the lines set up by the Treaty of Tordesillas as well play a factor. Now in the 1530s, we see colonists begin to settle on the coast of Brazil, and there is one really significant cash crop that is going to become very popular here in Brazil and being sent back to Portugal and then spread throughout Europe as trade, and it's going to be sugar. And you're going to see the growth of these giant plantations across Brazil to produce sugar. And this high demand in Europe means there's lots and lots of money. And remember, Portugal, even though they're extending their empire, whether it's in the Americas or whether it's in the East Indies, they're more of a trading-based empire. So they want resources, they want stuff to trade so they can get money. And you're going to see them expand the production of sugar, and ultimately this expansion of the production of sugar on these plantations, as well as the encomienda system and its brutality in the Spanish empire in the Americas, as well as the disease issues that natives are going to have, is going to lead to the Atlantic slave trade. And more on that later. We're going to do some stuff with the Atlantic slave trade later in this chapter. All right, guys, here you can actually see this is Cabral's voyage to Brazil in Calicut. So you can actually see this is his voyage where he starts off, goes to Brazil, claims it for Spain, settles, gives supplies, shoots around using the current across to Africa, kind of makes his way up the coast of East Africa, and then shoots across to India. And again, remember, all these bases are in control by the Portuguese, and there's influence there. All right, so now the influence that we're going to talk about, we're going to go back to the Spanish to finish this out, is we see that over time, Spain, their colonies in the Americas, as well as in the Philippines and other places they come in contact with, for a time are going to become the world's most powerful colonies and lead to Spain becoming the most powerful empire on earth, if only for a short time. This is going to be a golden age for them, really in every single sense of the word and every part of their culture. We're going to see an expansion of Spanish art and cultural aspects such as literature and so forth. Now, this empire needs protection, so they need to create a very powerful army and navy. And with that, we see that the Spanish also are pushing for other territories, again, to fund this and show off prestige and power. So they push north into what is going to be the southern United States. So in 1513, we see Ponce de Leon. He enters into Florida. He's in search for the so-called Fountain of Youth, the so-called mythical fountain that if you drink from its waters, you have eternal youth. We see Coronado go on an expedition later in that century in the American Southwest and claiming that for Spain. And then all amongst this, whether it's in the American Southwest, Florida, the Middle America or Mesoamerica or South America, we see Spanish priests coming in and spreading Catholicism. Okay, as the so-called conquistadors expand Spanish colonies and control. All right, so now this isn't going to be, we've talked about the expansion of the Spanish and a little bit of the Portuguese in the Americas, but this isn't all going to be peaceful after the fall of the Aztecs, the Inca, and the Maya. There is going to be opposition. Now, as the priests spread religion, they actually come across the harsh treatment and see this of the natives. And we're going to see a lot of criticism by Spanish Catholic priests criticizing the encomienda system. And this actually leads to the system itself being abolished very quickly in 1542. And that's a big kind of accomplishment in a lot of cases, that you actually have Spaniards pushing for, hey, you need to have better treatment of these people you're coming in contact with. But it actually leads to another oppressive system, an expansion of an oppressive system. And that, again, is the African slave trade and the slave system and plantation slavery that's going to develop in the American colonies or empires, depending on which group you're talking about. It's going to be pretty much the same. We're also going to see natives fight Spanish colonial rule throughout this period. One big example is in 1680, you see Pope is a Native American who leads a rebellion in what is today New Mexico that pushes back against the Spanish in their territory known as New Spain, which is New Spain. Now, there's going to be a brutal civil war and rebellion that's actually going to take place over this region for about 12 years, but the Spanish ultimately will be successful in regaining it. All right, guys, that's all I have for you in this lecture. So in the next ones, we're going to take a look at some expansion of the European influences in the Americas by the British, the French, and the Dutch. And then in the rest of the chapter, we're going to take a look at the Atlantic slave trade, and we'll take a look at the Columbian Exchange. But make sure you guys know, too, it might be a little confusing for you as we move through this because we might not do it in order because now they kind of all stand alone, and this is a big, giant chapter. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next one.